So we got this lunch and learn in a week late and 1 hour late, but I'm glad everybody made it. So to begin, let's all rise for prayer. Lord, our most holy God, our Father, we give you great thanks for the food today. Thanks for this museum. Thank you for the volunteers. Thank you for the Braun Foundation. Thank you for the country we live in. And thank you for those who are willing to serve, have served, and are serving. We thank you for the favorable weather we have today. And we also think of this day of 12 February, as a day many years ago when a man born of humble beginnings, Abraham Lincoln, became president. And we pray that this nation has the spirit and the understanding that people can rise from humble beginnings and lead this country. We go forward asking for your spirit and your wisdom to guide us in all we do. We give you great thanks in your name. Amen.
Amen.
I ask you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Larry Head will lead us in singing of our national anthem.
Thank you, John. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets lit glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Larry.
I think it would be possible to move that chair out so we get a little more elbow room. I moved over there, this chair out there.
Thank you to everyone who showed up today. We had this delay. I could tell you a long story about how the delay occurred and why it was done, but you don't want to hear that. We tried to communicate as best we could about the delay, and I see that there are many of you who understand that and are here today. By way of announcements, we're passing the helmets out, and today we have a special request. We have received a grant from the Indiana Historical Society that helps us fund our interactive screens. And one of the screens is currently in operation in the World War II Honor Gallery. And that screen displays the service uniforms of some of our local veterans. And there are two other screens we're working on. We're looking to find $2,500 to provide our share of our responsibility and commitment for this grant. So anything you can do to help us would be greatly appreciated. Wanted to say this, that next March 1st, a few weeks away, the museum hours of operation are changing. We will be open 7 days a week. We will be open from 11 to 4 p.m., 7 days a week. Also, on March 21st, there's a free presentation. It's focused on Rosie the Riveter. So we have Rosie the Riveter Day. It's a Saturday. Lucy Seidler, one of our real Rosie the Riveters, she riveted on the tail sections of P-47 aircraft. She's going to be here. She just turned 100 a few weeks ago. So please come on out. I appreciate seeing you here. So on to the main event. Our speaker today is Tom David. He's a volunteer here. Tom grew up in Evansville. He has a history in industry. Tom is a great asset for us. He's leading the repair of the tank. We're able to do that in-house here at the museum. Otherwise, we would be in a real difficult situation finding the tank repair house here in the tri-state area. So Tom's doing a great job. For his presentation today, Tom will be talking about Wherner von Braun when he was in Germany. And next week, I hope you can come because he will be talking about Wherner von Braun when he was in the United States. So Tom's presentation today will be a little bit different format. He will give his main presentation and take questions. And after a short break, anybody who wishes to hear the stories that his uncle Charles David had. Charles David worked with Wherner von Braun, and there are stories behind the scenes, the day-to-day talk, the meetings they were in, and Tom has benefited from receiving that information. So it's a real insight into what happened with Wherner von Braun. So as I say, there'll be a break, and if you wish to stay, Tom is willing to tell you stories till the night is over. Tom David.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. I have about 3 decades, to cover today, so I'm going to try to just hit the high points of his life in Germany. But I first want to open up with this one statement because it's, I want to share with each of you. I'm sure we have some German scholars among us. I am not. If you would talk to my wife, I have a hard enough time pronouncing the English language, let alone the German language. So I just want to share this quick story with you. My uncle shared this with me one time. When von Braun came to the United States, he would always introduce himself Wherner von Braun. He did not put the V in there. And so I decided to carry that throughout this talk today. So I'm not going to be interjecting the V with the WS, so I just want to share that with you real quickly. He was born March 23rd, 1912 in Prussia. He passed away at a young age of 65 in Alexandria, Virginia. And I want to start our discussion about him today on a particular subject that would end up defining some of the talk that you will hear about him, because usually people will talk about this subject many times about his presence in the United States. And I want to tell everybody I respect your point of view, because there are a lot of people in the United States that were really against bringing German scientists into America after World War II. So I want to let everybody understand I respect that. I respect everybody's point of view. And we'll be bringing up part of that in our discussion today, because that is part of the story that we're going to discuss. In 1944, at the very end of 44, we had a U.S. intelligence program get started by our Defense Department and in the intelligence community. And their purpose, they started thinking about post-war. They knew that things were going to be bad for Germany. The Russians are coming from the east, and our allies and us are coming from the west. So they decided they had a possibility of starting a program where, as I point out, they would recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians to leverage their expertise for military and technological advancement. Now, the gist of this is we were going to still possibly be fighting with Japan. Why not reap this technology? And also, of course, they were looking ahead post-war of the possibility of other problems that were going to be coming up, and of course that would be the Cold War. So they wanted to beat the Soviet Union to this technology, and they started this program called Operation Overcast. Later, about a year later, it became popular to be named Operation Paperclip. And from what I understand, the research I did, this basically meant when they would interview all of these scientists that they were able to apprehend. Of course, they would make sure that everybody understood they weren't prisoners, but they were asked to come to the United States. And they would later call this Operation Paperclip because they put a paperclip, on their file. That's how they identified the people that they were thinking about bringing over. So it would later be well known as Operation Paperclip. So the technology, what were they looking for? I decided to show 3 pictures of some of, and this is just some of the technology, but this is the well known. This is called the ME-262, Messerschmitt 262. This was a first produced fighter bomber jet powered, and it actually served in combat for the Germans. So this was just one of them. This one here, this is not a very good picture, but I like the silhouette of this. Anybody familiar with this one? I'm just curious if anybody knows what this is. Yes, this is the V1. Yeah, the V1. Now they did not have that designation until much later in the war, because Goebbels, the propaganda machine of Hitler, would start naming the vengeance weapons, but this happened much later in the war. But it was known as the V1. It was a flying bomb. A lot would refer to it as a cruise missile. The back end here, you can barely see the plume. There was a pulse jet engine that had a distinctive sound. And a lot of people would nickname it the buzz bomb. Some people call it the doodle bug. But it would later be called the V1. Now, I'm going to share a little bit more information about that in just a minute, because there's a concept where a lot of people thought Von Braun was the architect of this, and actually he wasn't. He was not the brainchild of this particular weapon. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Of course, last but not least, this is the V2. It was well known as the A4, the aggregate number 4 missile, while it was being developed. And of course, our subject today, this was his work, his handiwork. He was the lead technical director that developed this. And why this was such a big deal, and we'll discuss this in a little bit, was because when this ballistic missile was launched, it would topple over and come back to Earth faster than the speed of sound. That's why it's called a ballistic missile. So when it hit its target, nobody knew it was coming until it was all over. And there was no defense for this. So this was the premier weapon that our U.S. military definitely want to get their hands on. Of course, this is the man they were looking for. He was very young when he was in Germany during this time. This is Wherner von Braun. This is about what he would look like. The reason why I included this picture, because of his age. He was born in Prussia. His father, and you have to excuse me, I'm going to have to get my notes in front of me. I'm getting old, so I can't remember everything. But his father was a landowner. He was, of course, a civil servant in the early years during the Weimar Republic. And he would later become the Reich Ministry, or the Food Ministry, later in his life. Von Braun had 2 other brothers. He is the center one, right here. His oldest brother, Sigismund, was a lawyer. He studied law, and he later in life would become the ambassador for Germany to France. Magnus, his younger brother, would study chemistry, and he actually became a chemical engineer and followed his older brother during the development of the military weapon in in Germany. In his early years, his mother was very involved, I guess I should say, with the development of her 3 sons. She was very educated. Her name was Emmy, and she enjoyed music. And her middle child, Wherner, became interested. He became he played the piano and the cello real well, and he also could play Beethoven and Bach by memory. And he would dream of someday becoming a composer. But there was another side to the young Wherner. He liked to work with his hands, and he also liked mechanical things. So in the 20s, when he's growing up, the automobile is becoming of age, and of course, him and a friend of his decided they were going to do this. They commandeered an old garage, combed the neighborhood looking for parts, and they would dream of someday starting their own automobile manufacturing. So his mind was always working on things. And this is an interesting point about this, because something in his life, he became so driven when he would focus on something like this, his studies actually were deteriorating dramatically. And the parents were a little concerned about this. He was almost described as a class clown. He would focus on things he wanted to do, but when it comes to his studies, he wasn't that interested. This will change, of course, later. His mother also was an avid astronomer. She enjoyed astronomy, and he became interested in this. And this all will come back because of the era. In the 20s, we had a lot of things happening with science fiction. And Von Braun loved to read novels from H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, about science fiction, about traveling to other planets. And this would start to plant the seeds in his head that what it would be like to build a spaceship. So in 1925, he is 13 years old. He receives a telescope from his mother for his birthday, and he was also confirmed at that time in the Lutheran faith. And he also came across this particular work by Hermann Oberth. It was called The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. This was the beginning. Magnus would talk about this a lot in the States. You could see the fire was lit with Wherner von Braun. He became so involved with trying to understand what was in this book, because it was the blueprint by a rocket pioneer in Germany at that time. And he realized one thing when he opened the pages. It was full of mathematics. And he was doing terrible in his studies. This all changed. He turned his life around. His brother said that he became so involved and he concentrated so much at home that he became not just the class clown. He would turn out to become probably the leading student in the class. He would actually lead the discussions, they said. He turned his life around that quickly. He was so driven for this. You have to excuse me, I'm gonna have to take a drink real quick. During the 20s, there was a lot of clubs, societies would pop up about rocketry. It became very popular. It was a hobby for some, but some would take it a lot more seriously. Anybody ever seen this car? Just curious. Fritz von Opel. Anybody ever heard of Opel car manufacturer in Germany? Fritz, you can't really see it, but this is a rocket car. So in the 20s, you had a lot of this going on. They were getting so interested in this field of technology, they started applying it to a lot of things. And so I wanted to include that picture because that's just a demonstration. So young Wherner decided that he would build his car. But it wasn't quite a car. Him and his brother would commandeer an old toy wagon they had. Has anybody heard this story? It's been told to me a few times. They strapped these rockets on this little wagon, they decided that they would go down to downtown Berlin at the time and demonstrate their new car. It didn't turn out too well for him. Magnus said that when they lit it, it was so fast that they both jumped back. People were running for their lives, as you can imagine. Downtown Berlin, it ended up in a storefront window with a window busted. And I'm sure the ride home that night wasn't good for Wherner because the authorities caught up with him, and of course they had his father pick him up. But I wanted to include that because I'm just trying to give you an idea that this is on a lot of people's minds, the advancement of rocketry and what it could do for space travel. So 1927, the Society for Space Travel was founded. Herman Oberth would be one of the founding members. This would be a more serious group that actually would start working on, especially the liquid fuel rocket, the engine itself. They would start trying to develop this and produce the thrust that would be required. Herman Oberth had this in his book about what it would take. They would start looking at the physics of overcoming gravity, the weight versus the thrust, everything that they were going to try to concentrate on. I pointed this out because in 1930, Braun, Wherner, will join this group. He seeked them out and he would join him. He was only 18 years old when he did this. So he joined this group. He's working with people that are twice his age. As I said earlier, I'm never going to try to pronounce the German for the society, but they would use this acronym VFR. That was the acronym they used for the Space Society. They were able to locate, they needed some property. They were having to raise funds on their own, but they would locate some property just south of Berlin, and they would build a pad where they would continue to do their tests with their rocket engines. This is a quick picture. 18-year-old. Wherner's right here, probably not very, very clear. But the gentleman right here next to him in the forefront is Herman Oberth. So this is a picture that was taken at the society when they were working on rocket technology. This is another good picture of Wherner at the same location. You can notice he liked to get his hands dirty. You can see that coat. I'm sure at his age he had to do a lot of the dirty work, you know. But he was enthused. He was really excited to be there. 1932 was a turning point. What was happening in 1932? The Great Depression. So a lot of countries were affected, including Germany. This was the number one problem they would have, and that was to raise funds to continue the research. And so in steps the military. Now the military was very much aware of this group, and the reason why I say that is there's a Captain Walter Dornberger who's only about 30 miles south from where they're at Kummersdorf. And this is actually a German military facility where they're working with the rocketry for German military. So what I want to point out is liquid-fueled rocket technology was not something that was ever conceived of in 1918 at the Versailles Treaty. So what that means is there was no restrictions for it. And of course, Dornberger and the German army knew this. So they decided, we need to look into this. They'd already planted the seed that they thought this could be a technology used in the military, but this would open the door. So, sure enough, Captain Walter Dornberger, he was in charge of the solid rocket research and development in the Ordnance Department of the German Army at Kummersdorf, and he recognized the potential of liquid fuel rockets. So what he did, he knew they were financially having trouble. He decided to raise some money and sign a contract with them for a demonstration. Give them some money and let them show him what they developed. It didn't turn out too well for him, unfortunately. Braun, Wherner actually was the one who would ignite the engine. It was just a test with an engine. It wasn't a rocket. but it unfortunately blew up. So Von Braun was pretty depressed, the fact that this was his chance to demonstrate some of the work, but it didn't pan out too well for him that day. Nevertheless, Dornberger already knew that he was going to go to the society and suggest that he would fund their research, come work for me at Evansville. And they rejected it as a group. But a 20-year-old got a proposal that he didn't expect that was coming. Walter Dornberger saw some genius in Von Braun and approached him separately. And he said, I'll secure a grant to continue your education and your research for your PhD in physics from the University of Berlin. He was going to go ahead and finance his education to continue on to his PhD. Not only that, but of course on the flip side, please continue to work with me at Coopersville. Von Braun accepted, of course. He was 20 years old. He knew that it would take an enormous amount of money to continue on this dream of building a rocket, especially a rocket that could overcome our gravity and travel into space. So he accepted. So this was the beginning, 1933, and it was called the Aggregate Series of Rockets. They developed rockets from the A1 up to the A10. We'll talk more about that later. But in December of 1933, they began the A1 development. And one of the things, and let me confirm something here real quick. One of the things I'll point out, the A1 was not, well, it was basically a disaster for him. It blew up on the launch pad. But they learned, he would always talk about every time in research, you learn something. And so they decided to go back to the drawing board. They would work on the A2, and they made a lot of changes. So I'm going to start doing things in order by the year they happened. I want to give you an idea of what's happening in the big box around him. In 34, Hitler becomes Fuhrer, and Von Braun will receive his PhD from the University of Berlin, and they would work on the A2 or they would actually launch the A2 in December of 1934. They realized that they couldn't probably launch this rocket if it was going to go over a mile in altitude. They were concerned, of course, for the security of other people on the ground. So they had to move. They started talking about moving their test sites. The A2 was tested on a small island. This is Germany right here. On a small island called Wartime, and it was the only time they actually launched from this island, but they launched 2 of them, and they were successful. If I've got my notes correctly, the first one went about 1.5 miles, the other one went just over 2 miles in altitude. This set the stage. Everybody heard about this. This raised eyebrows. That's when they realized that a liquid fuel rocket could become a military weapon. And so that gave Walter Dornberger a lot of clout to start thinking about where we're going from here. I need to point out real quickly, by the way, Walter Dornberger is Von Braun's superior. Von Braun is a lead technical director with their team, but Walter Dornberger, who would later be promoted to general, was the one that Von Braun always answered to him. So they decided, and actually the Luftwaffe gets involved in this. The German Air Force buys the property. It's on a little island. It's actually located about right here. This is the Baltic Sea. This was the North Sea. This is the Baltic. And it's located on an island about right here. And it was called Peenemünde. And this was the beginning of the huge rocket research center for the German army. And they were going to start constructing this. And actually, the Air Force is involved, the Luftwaffe was involved in this also. So I want to explain this real quick back to the V1. I'm going to try to move it along quicker. The V1 was developed there also. That's why a lot of people automatically said Von Braun designed that. He did. But they actually had an area called Peenemünde West. That's where the Luftwaffe was at. And of course, John Von Braun's group, or I should say Walter Dornberger's group, was to the east on this island. So they start to build this, and it doesn't get completed until late 37. Yes?
One question about Peenemünde. Did they bomb that at all ever?
We're going to get there. I'll try to move along a little quicker here. Yeah, you're getting ahead of me a little bit. So 37, the Army Research Center is developed. It's enormous. It's all contained. They have their own power plant. They're building facilities to make the liquid oxygen for the fuel. I mean, it is a humongous undertaking. They have 9 departments. Von Braun will have 9 departments in here. They build a wind tunnel for aerodynamics. They built, of course, they'll have labs for the chemistry of the fuel. They'll have metallurgy shops for structural design. It's enormous. The first, I'm getting ahead of myself just a minute. I need to go ahead and point this out. So Von Braun is 25 years old at the time, and this is the big decision right here. Because Walter goes to Von Braun and says, got one problem. You're going to have to become a member of the Nazi Party. If we're going to support this, Hitler wants you to be loyal. So he knew this was a decision that he would probably have to make at some time, and he did agree to become a member of the Nazi Party at that time. And I'm sure at his age, he felt like this was the only way he was going to continue, and that's basically how Dornberger would lay it out to him. So the A3, the first test launch, and the A3 was again a huge leap of development from the A2. I don't want to get into a lot of the technical jargon, but they were going from a single axis gyro to a 3-axis gyro. They were doing a lot of things. It was a much larger engine. They were doing a lot of things with the A3 to keep moving and advancing in this technology. The actual first test of the A3 was on an island north of Peenemünde. They didn't have Peenemünde finished yet, so they did do that first test there. And they did have a lot of problems with the A3. And it basically had to do with guidance. So there was a problem here. They already had the A4 on the drawing board, and the A4 again was a huge leap from the A3. And they realized because of the problems with atmospheric conditions and guidance, they decided to develop the A5 as a step between the A3 and A4. So if you ever hear them talk about the A5, it actually was developed before the A4 because they decided to make another stepping stone in that development. In 1940, there were actually 8 A5 tests. They actually did some of the tests. I found this interesting. Not all of them were a launch. Some of them were drop tests. They actually took the missile up and dropped it at high altitudes, working with the guidance of the system. This is what really becomes talked about right here. Heinrich Himmler sent one of his officers to Von Braun and said, we need you to join the SS. And he rejected this a couple times, pushing it aside. But he realized they weren't going to let go of this. So he would go to Dornberger, and they had some pretty lengthy discussions about this. And Dornberger finally said, it's a political move. They're not going to take any of your time. And if we're going to continue on with this development, this may be an area that you can't refuse. Now, I want to share this thought with you because this is where the SS plays in this picture. Dornberger would state this fact one time, that the SS was always trying to get their finger in the pie. They wanted to get involved in this. They wanted to be part of this. And so this was one of those areas where Walter thought, of course, he's an Army general, but they're wanting to get von Braun over on the SS. So it did happen. He accepted it finally. I don't think he was too happy to, but he did accept it. And he was a second lieutenant, was his rank when he was accepted. He would later be promoted to a major from his work at Peenemünde. This, of course, brings up that moral decision, right? This is what everybody talks about today. We're still talking about this today, about the involvement of the German scientists in the German regime and whether they should have been allowed to come over here. So we'll talk more about that. 1940-42, they finally got the A4 developed. They had many setbacks. They were having problems, and they weren't all design problems. Some of them were just technical assembly problems. They were not assembling something correctly. The actual gantry that held it up, one time it actually had one fall off. It was that bad. It was a little embarrassing for some of them. So it really started to create a problem, because what I didn't discuss with everybody is that they had to gain Hitler's confidence in order to have the money to do this. So everybody's fighting for the money. I know that's hard to believe that they would actually have to pay for this development, but Hitler had to distribute this through all of the branches. So when they went through this period in Peenemünde, it didn't look real good for them, for von Braun especially, being the lead director. And at the same time, Hitler decides to do what? Start a second front. So into the Soviet Union he goes in June of 1941. I bring that up because that plays a huge role in this later on. I point out there was some internal chaos, and that's basically because they didn't know if they were going to be able to keep developing this because of the funds they needed to do it. Well, guess what? In October of 1942, success. They finally were able to have a successful launch, and the A4 makes history. The height of the rocket was 46 feet. The diameter was 5 feet 5 inches. At the base, the diameter was a little bigger with fins, about 12 feet. The weight was 28,000 pounds. It could carry a 2,000-pound warhead. The range was 168 miles. That meant it could travel 168 miles from where it was launched to where it would land. The altitude, and this is the biggie, this is what everybody talks about, 50 miles. Now the reason why that's big, it was the first man-made rocket to ever really hit the edge of space. So this made big news. This would start to really rattle some chains around the world, that they were capable of doing this. The one thing though that was stressed, or I want to stress, I should say, is that it was an immature rocket. What I'm trying to say is, yes, they were successful that launch, but their next three weren't. In other words, it still had areas of development to be, to be a better, excuse me, sometimes I can't, my wife laughs at me, I can't get the word out, but to be more successful, let's put it that way. Here's a picture of Peenemünde with one of the rockets, with some of the support system around them. 1943, Hitler would approve production of the rocket. And Albert Speer, who was the lead in the German military, he was the head of armaments and munitions. And he would be Walter's boss, basically. He would suggest that they would use, of course, foreign prisoners from concentration camps and inmates as a production to build the rocket at Peenemünde. So this was a huge decision. I wanted to make sure I pointed out Hans Kammler. Anybody ever heard that name? He is Heinrich Himmler's right-hand man, is what I call him. He was an architect. He designed Auschwitz, almost all the camps. He was recognized as a ruthless person. Speer would actually call him one day a member of Hitler's henchmen. I mean, in fact, Speer actually kind of feared him to some degree because he had that aura where wherever he went, there was death. Of course, this was involved with the camps. So Albert Speer suggested it, and this was nothing new. They were already doing this. We were bombing their cities left and right. They had to take a lot of things underground, and they would start using, of course, prisoners in these camps to supply labor, because after the Eastern Front started, they didn't have manpower. This is definitely a war crime, if you're wondering. It's against the Geneva Convention to hire anybody. They're supposed to have been paid, for one thing, under the Geneva Convention, but they also were not to make product of the war. So this was a definite war crime to do this. Now, of course, at the time, I'm sure Hitler or his leaders were worried about that. 1943, a SS camp was founded at Peenemünde. Slave labor came from Buchenwald. They came there, and I put this in here because Hans Kammler's involved. He's involved in this. He's the one who gets the prisoners there, constructs the camps, and again, he's wanting to get his teeth into this. And Speer was kind of walking this line like he understood the conditions in these camps and how they were under Hans Kammler. And he kind of wanted to make sure that this facility was a little better than what a lot of other prisoners were faced with when they were working at these sub-camps, at these factories as slave laborers. I think this is important. I had to really dig to find that information. It's hard to find. But there are several prisoners who actually would come back later and talk about this and would ratify the fact that it was a little bit better at Peenemünde than a lot of other camps. This is all going to change very quickly, and we'll explain in a minute. So to answer your question, right here, excuse me, just 1 second. So they would construct the Dora concentration camp near the production plant. I'm sorry, I'm jumped ahead here. My bad. I accidentally hit the wrong side. So to answer your question, yes, in August of 1943, British bombed Peenemünde. This is a big, you're welcome. This is a big deal. Their intelligence, the British intelligence, learned where it was at. They conducted an air raid, and they were successful in the bombing, but not in what actually the destruction was. And unfortunately for a lot of prisoners died because the bombs hit that camp. Von Braun's team did lose one important member, but Von Braun survived. Walter Thiel, his life was lost, and he was one of the engineers that was really detrimental in the propulsion part of the engine. He did most of that design. A lot of people think that Von Braun was the mastermind behind all this, but Von Braun had a lot of gifted men. When I say gifted, I mean in their technology, that he was the lead technical director, but he had a lot of men under him that were very, very good at what they did. So they lost Walter Thiel in that bombing. In 1943 and 1944, Speer will gather Hans Kammler, General Warnberger, and a couple of others and say, we're going to have to move this. We can't have it at Peenemünde. So they went, and everybody heard of millwork, the factory. So they moved underground in the Harz Mountains in central Germany. It was an old abandoned gypsum mine, and they decided to produce the rocket there. Now, they did not have any facility there yet to accommodate the slave laborers. So this is where it gets bad. Hans Kammler becomes involved in this, And the only thing that the prisoners have at first, they have to widen the tunnels, they have to extend the tunnels, and they have to work in these caves. And all they're given is straw for a bed, no sanitary development for it, hardly any food, and this is when the deaths start happening, at the very beginning. Later, they would finally build what was called Dora concentration camp near the plant, and they would call this middle work Baldora. I want to talk about this a minute, about Hans Kammler. In his mind, if you were a prisoner or undesirable, you were just a casualty of war. In other words, if you came to work for me and you couldn't do what I needed to do, you were pushed aside and fresh blood come in. Most inhumane person that I've ever heard of when you really listen to what he was about. And that's why Spear called him a henchman. He had no conscience to me. The only thing that mattered to him was to win this war for Germany. And no matter what the cost, it didn't matter. So this is what we would end up finding when we would end up there, is these poor prisoners of war would suffer tremendously in unbelievable conditions. And so they did finally build the concentration camp, but they were so malnourished that there were so many of them that passed away at this facility, building this rocket and other actually products of war also were done at Millwork. So I'm going to lay this out. 1944, there's a lot that happens. In March of 1944, von Braun's arrested. Him and two of his friends went to, I'm just going to add this, to a pub. But the drink became heavy, and von Braun would loosen up and talk about some things with his friends about why he was there and what he really wanted to do in life. And of course, that was to go to space. The Gestapo had a lot of spies everywhere. And of course, this gets back to Heinrich Himmler. And so Himmler would go ahead and quarantine these guys. They would say they put him in jail, but I don't think the accommodations were real bad for von Braun. But he did say that you would be brought up on treason. And you can imagine at that time, von Braun was starting to second guess exactly what was going to happen in his life. Just real quickly, Walter Dornberger with Speer talked Hitler into releasing him. So he does get released. But you can imagine in his mind, he's starting to understand where things are headed here with his association with the SS. In July, does anybody remember the famous assassination attempt at Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters? With the table, they lay a bomb in a briefcase on the table. Luckily, I shouldn't say this, didn't mean to say luckily, right? Hitler was not killed. The table took a lot of the blast. He was injured, but very slightly. And so that assassination attempt definitely changed Hitler's decision-making in the future. He definitely lost faith in his inner circle, especially his military commanders. He would start, and you start seeing this, he trusted Heinrich Himmler, and he would start putting Himmler in charge of a lot of things that are going to happen from now on, and we'll talk about that. So, this is what happens. Hitler tells Heinrich, you're going to take over A4 production. Heinrich hands that over to who? Hans Kammler. So Hans Kammler actually is the one that takes over this production. And what this means is that Walter Dornberger is no longer in charge of the A4 secret weapons project. He is no longer the boss of von Braun. Von Braun has to answer to Hans. So I wanted to make sure to point this out. So I'm going to go back to this. Let me back up. So in September was the first launch of the A4. It was not called the V2 yet. It was still called A4. It was actually in Paris when we were liberated. That was actually the first launch. It wasn't in England or Antwerp. It was actually in Paris. Happened in September. November is when Goebbels decides to have the famous propaganda vengeance weapon, secret military weapons, and they renamed the A4 the V2. So that's when we had the V1 and V2 were named. So it didn't happen until November of 1944. Middle Baldor camp. Hans Kammler was responsible, as I said, for a lot of the inhumane treatment of many prisoners. And here's the touchy part. Von Braun is required to be in charge and involved in helping secure labor at this camp. He wasn't ever directly involved at Peenemünde with the labor camp, but now he is. Now he is. And he's also in charge of quality control. That means he has to visit the camp. I'll point something out real quickly. We're all human. And I will tell you this right up front, because I know this story from my uncle. When he came to the United States, he wasn't very truthful about this, and reasonably so. You didn't want to affiliate yourself with such a horrible regime. So he would tell people that he did not visit, but maybe once or twice. That actually wasn't true. That comes out later, and we'll discuss that next week. But I just wanted to point that out because that is important about this point of view of how tied he was to this regime and how energetic he was to follow through with their demands. Many people will say he was trapped. I look at it this way. I'm sure when he was arrested, he realized, am I going to stay alive? And I'm sure when he was released, he realized that his life could be in danger at any time. And one of his associates, his name was Conrad Dannenberg. I saw a video of him. It was actually a video where they interviewed Dannenberg when he worked at NASA with Von Braun, but he was much older. And the reporter came to him and asked him this question. He said, what choices did Von Braun have? And I'll never forget Conrad, of course he's a German, looked down and looked up, said, yep, he had choices. He had two. He had two choices. He could walk away, or he could continue to follow orders. But if he walked away, he'd be shot. And that's exactly what he said. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think they were that vicious. Later, when things are in chaos, Hitler will give the command that no German scientist with this much technology was to stay alive. They were not to be captured by the enemy. The Gestapo the SS guards had orders to shoot them, to keep them from being captured. Approximately 3,000 launched, the V2 that is, launched on UK, Belgium, and France. Approximately 9,000 died from those launches. Approximately 30,000 people died building the V2. It did not change the war. I'm going to end this up here, wrap it up here pretty quickly. I wanted to include these two quotes. This gentleman wrote several articles about the V2, and I found this quote spot on. I have two of them. His name is Paul, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Grigoriev. That's how I'm going to say it. I'd like to read it to you. Many of us are impressed by the technical achievement of building so many complex new military weapons so rapidly under such a harsh condition. As we mull over the achievement, however, we must never forget the scope of the human sacrifice made for each piece and part that was disgorged from these workshops. So I thought that was a pretty good point of view that was right on. The next one is from a gentleman. I have his book right here. He is the renowned, as far in my book, he has done more extensive research about Von Braun than anybody else. His name is Michael J. Neufeld. He's actually the chairman at the Smithsonian Aerospace Museum. He's received many, many awards for his writings. And so I wanted to include this. This really stuck out in my mind when I was thinking about the point of view. And we're talking about Von Braun. The comfortable cocoon of Army ordnance could no longer protect it. High Nazi authorities would intervene directly in a project now viewed as an urgent national priority. Ultimately, he would have to come face to face with the apparatus of oppression, slavery, and murder at the heart of the government for which he so energetically labored. So again, this kind of hits it on the nail about how people could understand that some believed he shouldn't have been allowed, it was a moral issue, but others believed the technology was prudent for our national defense. 1945, and I could spend an hour talking about this subject, so I'm not going to go there. I could go down rabbit holes about this, how he did it. I keep doing this, I'm sorry. But he ended up, the team had they had a lot, on Von Braun's desk, he had a lot of orders. There was chaos. The Russians are coming from the east, we're coming from the west. And so he had a lot of orders. Some say stay, some say go. He was so he got his chaps. He would always call them his chaps. He got his chaps together and says, "What are we going to do?" I mean, he would include them in this discussion. And of course, they decided right then and there that if they were going to survive and be captured, there was only one place they wanted to go. Anybody know where that is? Yeah, right here. That's right. They wanted to come here. So they started to devise a plan. They had no idea whether this would work. They would keep working their way south through checkpoints. They had to use fake orders. Von Braun would be seen in his uniform a lot at that time. It was his shield, right? He had to use his involvement with the SS to get through the guards, get through the checkpoints, to work their way south. Bottom line is they ended up in a pretty lavish resort in the Bavarian Alps. He was a very charismatic individual, very high strung, very high spirited. And he convinced the guards that we can't keep everybody here, because the guards were watching him. The guards were with him, by the way. The SS knew where he was at that time. But he convinced them that we can't keep everybody here at one time. We got to let some go to the town. If they'd have an air raid, it'd kill us all. Well, anyway, you can imagine he was able to work it to where he would get everybody out of there and head to the Swiss Alps. Von Braun and his teams would escape. Hitler dies in 1945. Von Braun surrenders to the U.S. Army May 2nd, 1945. I saved this picture. There's a lot of pictures of them surrendering. You can find them on the internet all over the place. I saved this one because I want to share this quick story, and we'll wrap it up. This gentleman right here is Walter Gerber. That's his superior. So this man is responsible. When you really think about it, he was responsible for this to happen. If he would not have picked this young, bright engineer, a lot of this may not have happened. It might have. But under Von Braun's leadership, they were able to break the barriers of rocketry and go into space. He would end up not coming with them to Fort Bliss. This is where they'll end up at when they come to the United States. Von Braun's team, about 127 of them came to Fort Bliss. He would end up in the hands of the United Kingdom, the British, I should say. He was actually put on trial. They decided to go ahead and put him on trial for war crimes. They actually had him for over a year and a half. And he won that trial. He was acquitted. He was able to prove that all the decisions that were being made at the time were taken away from him. He couldn't be held accountable for what happened at Delaware. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just telling you that's what took place. He would end up coming back to the United States He worked for the Air Force. And he was one of the primary engineers of the X-15. Anybody ever heard of that? Yeah. So I wanted to include that story. The X-15 led to the space shuttle that developed. So I wanted to conclude that. He had a lot of quotes. This is one of my favorite ones. My experiences with science led me to God. They challenged science to prove the existence of God, but must we really light a candle to see the sun? And I'm going to end it with that. As John said, we'll have a quick question and answer session here. My uncle spent several years with Von Braun's team in Huntsville at the Marshall Space Flight Center, which was inside Redstone Arsenal. That's where Von Braun would end up with the Army at first. And so I'd be glad to share some of those stories if anybody wants to come back after, we're going to have a little intermission here, a little short break after the question and answer. So I just wanted to include that. Thank you. Yes.
I just have one last question for you, sir.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in 1945, the Russians were coming from the east and the Americans were coming from the west. Is that correct?
That is correct. Well,
What?
Actually, if you want to look at it on the map, they were kind of coming in at an angle, so they're kind of coming from the northeast, the Russians, and we were kind of coming in from the southwest, so to speak. I mean, the lines would change from day to day. Go ahead.
So my question is, if you had any insight or idea or possibilities, what made Wherner von Braun decide to go to the Americans instead of the Russians?
Okay, that's good point. You know what he actually said?
I wasn't alive.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm referring to the fact that he told people this is what I'm trying to say. So this is actually a historical statement, and it's a good point to bring up. He said it was a moral decision, and I know a lot of people will think, well, why were you involved in this? But he actually said that. He realized America was a Christian nation, okay? He realized that they would be treated fairly. He had no ambitions whatsoever to go to a communist country. No ambitions at all. No, the Germans hated the communists. Okay, I don't know if you knew that. Oh yes. Oh yes, Hitler hated the communists. Oh yeah, that's why he invaded them. Yeah, Don.
What did they use for after the
You know, a good question. I don't know. It was actually captured by the Soviet Union. So I think they created a big port there, and it was used in the military. Of course, the Soviet Union, of course, took they took all of Berlin, of course.
The 398 bomb group lost in Libya August 4th, 1944. It's a experimental facility.
I can't answer that. I mean, from what my research was, you know, from what I understand, the British were able to figure out where it was from the Germans at a prison camp. They actually wired some prison camps and got to discuss it. And they were talking about this in the prison camp, and that's what I understood. That's what I've researched. Yes.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
Over there.
Yes.
A friend of mine was Harry Imes. I don't know if you ever came across that name or not, but he worked with Wherner and also came here to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked Wherner one day, is it okay if I disappear? Will that cause you any problem here in the United States? And Wherner said, no, this is a free country. You can do what you want.
Right.
So Harry ended up in Canada.
Okay.
And Waterloo is where we work
Okay.
together on different projects.
Well, cool.
Did his name ever show up in any?
I can't recall. No, I can't. You know, there are so many names I've read about,
Yeah.
but I'm getting older, and my wife will tell you I don't retain that information.
Well, he mentioned that there was a test
Yeah.
that Hitler gave to
Yeah.
all the Germans,
Okay.
and of course Einstein was way up there, Wherner was way up there,
Yeah.
and Harry was number 3.
Okay,
And he ended up working on radar
okay.
in Canada. So I didn't know if it had ever come up or not, but quite a guy.
Let me say this real quickly, because a lot of people concentrate on Von Braun and his achievements and where he ended up in the States. But when Operation Paperclip came, and it lasted for 4.5 years. There was 1,500 technicians, engineers, scientists came all over. Not Von Braun's group at Fort Bliss worked for the Army, but there were people going to the Air Force. There was so much technology in medicine, in synthetics. I mean, there was a lot of areas of this technology came to the United States through Operation Paperclip. It wasn't just the rocketry, is what I'm trying to say.
I have a question. In America, did the Allies have a program during the war?
Yes, they did. The British did. I didn't mention that, just to save time, but the British did have I forget what they called it. Steve, I remember reading about it. In fact, it was partly that program is the reason why Walter Dornberger ended up with English. They were able to commandeer him. They brought him on board through that program. Of course, then they decided they wanted to see if he could stand up to the court of law and be acquitted. And he was. But he ended up in the States. Yes, they did. Yeah. And so did the Russians. I didn't probably explain this very well. The Russians were trying to do the same thing. Now here we go again. I got to pull his name out of my head. The leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin. He was upset that they got Von Braun, the U.S. Oh, he was mad. Yeah, there's a lot of that in the history books about that if you research it. Yes.
You mentioned 2 rockets, the A rocket and the B rocket. Were those just letters, or did they actually?
Yeah, the aggregate series, the A.
A is aggregate.
Yes, the A stands for the aggregate. The A series rockets became, the A4 is what became the V2.
What does the B stand for?
Vengeance. Now, I cannot say the German word. There may be a scholar here that can tell you. It's a lot longer than vengeance. I've looked at it and I am not even going to try. Okay, but maybe I didn't talk about the M1, the V1. Back to that's development. They were working on the later part of the development of the V1 impedimenta, the guidance and the trajectory. And I'm not to say that some of the branches under the leadership of Von Braun, talking about the departments, may have given or worked on part of the guidance system of the V1. So if you sit there and say, well, Von Braun didn't do that, part of that research development was for the V1 also. But I'm just trying to stress this was under the Luftwaffe. This was not under the German army with Von Braun. Okay, yeah.
What happened, what about the families of all these people that?
Good point. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot to mention that. I actually was going to mention that. That was part of the Germans insisted. They told the leaders of Operation Paperclip. Major Toftoy, I think is his name, was probably the leader of the group that was seeking out these German scientists. And when they negotiated, I mean, that was kind of a touchy situation because they would surrender as prisoners, but they were brought over here as civilians and were given a job. But yes, to answer your question, the families definitely, they made sure, I'm talking about the Germans, made sure their families could come. And they did. He went to Fort Bliss, by the way, if you know where that is, it's close to San Diego. Conditions were terrible there. So you can imagine living in the desert for a while. Yes. Yes, you're right. You're exactly right. They did. They brought him over at a later date. They didn't come immediately.
There's more yet.
Okay, go ahead.
There's more.
Okay.
The U.S. was failing to bring him over.
Okay.
So the German scientists, Von Braun and his buddies,
Okay.
went on strike.
Okay.
Went on strike, wasn't going to do any more development work. and within 10 days, the families were here.
That's a good story. I'm glad you shared that. No, I was not aware of that. Thank you for sharing. Yes, they were, Fort Bliss is right next to El Paso, Texas. Yeah, El Paso, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'll take a couple more and then I'm gonna take a break here. Anybody? Thank you for sharing that. It's always, there's always new history that always comes out.
The V1, it was so slow, I'm over here.
Yeah.
It was so slow that the British, like Spitfires, could attack the thing and shoot them down.
Yeah.
And you could see them coming.
Yeah, that's right.
It wasn't like the V2, which you never knew it was there.
Exactly. If anybody remembers, I'm terrible with names. If anybody remembers, we actually had someone here that was stationed in France, and I forget the gun. It's just about like the one that's at the armory over here on Wabash. It's out front. But they actually had groups that would shoot these down because they were slow. So yes, the V1 was not it wasn't a very accurate weapon. It definitely didn't change the war. And they were capable to shoot some of them down before they arrived to the targets. The interesting story on that. I read this somewhere. This is the bunny trail I talk about all the time. They would run out of fuel. That's how they were designed to hit their target. So the British got smart and made sure that the airwaves would hear this. They put too much in it. They put too much fuel. It overshot our town. They would send out those fake messages to make the Germans put in the incorrect amount of fuel. The games of war. Yes. Well, listen, I'm going to take a break. My mouth is getting dry, and I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Spitfires were fast. They could go into the beat. They would flip it. They would take it when they flip it, and they just
I was just about ready to say something like that.
That was part of the Battle of Bristol after
Yeah.